Hi, my name is Jenna, and I will be going over Essay 3 of Exam 1 for Bio 461. In this discussion, I'm going to discuss the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which is also known as the autonomic nervous system. And I will also briefly touch the somatic nervous system, which is all part of what's called the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. I will go in more in depth in the autonomic nervous system by going over the points of origin, the number of neurons, the location of the ganglia, the neurotransmitters, the receptors and their actions. And then in that I will go over cholinergic versus adrenergic and explain what that means. I will go over subdivisions, and then I will go over mechanisms of those receptors. So to begin, in our nervous system is divided into two parts. So we have the CNS, or the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And that's really all the CNS is. And then we have the PNS, like I said before, is going to be subdivided into the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. So, one thing I failed to mention, the PNS is going to cover everything else. So it's going to cover everything that is not the brain and the spinal cord. So, in the somatic nervous system, essentially it consists of sensory or afferent neurons, which I'll abbreviate as AFF. That's going to be myelinated, and that is going to innervate the brain. So this will be the brain here. And then from the brain, we will have our efferent neurons, or our motor neurons, and that's going to innervate our skeletal muscle, which is responsible for voluntary movement. In the autonomic nervous system, that is going to be responsible for involuntary movements, such as contractions of the stomach, or the intestines, or the digestive system. And that is going to be further subdivided into our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is known as our fight, flight, freeze system. And our parasympathetic is known as rest and digest. And these both work together in order for our body to do whatever it needs to do in whatever situation we're in. So if we're, for example, we're running from a bear, our sympathetic nervous system will turn on, whereas if we need to eat or we're sleeping, our parasympathetic nervous system will turn on. Now, a couple of things. I will go over some of the pathways. So here's the brain again. This will be the spinal cord. This is our heart. This is our diaphragm. This is the liver. This is a kidney with the adrenal gland. Now, I'm going to cover 4 different pathways that the sympathetic nervous system can do. So the first one, we will start in what's called the lateral horn of the spinal cord, specifically the ventral root. And that is going to go through, this is called the sympathetic chain ganglia, where it's going to synapse into another neuron. And this neuron is going to travel to skin, hair follicles, and blood vessels. And this pathway is going to consist of spinal nerves. That's our first pathway. Our second pathway, same thing, we're going to start in the lateral horn. And then we are going to go into the sympathetic chain ganglia again. But this time, we're going to come over here where the heart is and synapse. And this will be known as the sympathetic nerve. Sympathetic nerves will do this pathway. The third one is pretty special because it's going to travel below our diaphragm. So these first two will be above the diaphragm. The second two are going to be below the diaphragm. So this one is going to travel through, but it's not going to synapse yet. It's going to travel down here, and it's going to synapse in the collateral chain ganglia. And this first nerve is going to be known as the splanchnic nerve. Splanchnic nerve. And once the splanchnic nerve hits the collateral chain ganglia, it's going to become the collateral nerve, which is going to travel down all the way to the liver and synapse. So this is our collateral nerve. So splanchnic nerve, splanchnic, collateral. And then our last pathway of the sympathetic nervous system is called the adrenal medulla nerve, is what I like to call it. It's going to travel through the sympathetic chain ganglia, through the collateral ganglia, to the adrenal medulla, and it's going to be one neuron that synapses in the adrenal medulla. Now that's all the pathways for the sympathetic nervous system. For the parasympathetic nervous system, that is also known as the craniosacral system. So it is actually going to begin further up. So this is our cell body. And it is going to synapse in the brain. It's also going to go down and it's going to cross it's going to synapse in what's called the terminal ganglia. So actually, let me redraw that. But it's going to synapse into the terminal ganglia, which is located in pretty much all the organs in our body. So, for example, it's going to look like that. So our terminal ganglia is going to be located in the kidney. It can also be located in the liver, and it can also be located in the heart. Now going forward, I'm going to erase this. I'm going to now talk about the different receptors and the different neurotransmitters that are involved in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So for the sympathetic, once again, we have 3 different pathways. So I'll draw 3 pathways. parasympathetic, there's one major pathway. So for the first one, I'll label this as the pre-ganglionic and the post-ganglionic. That will be the case for each neuron. So for the first one, it is going to produce a neurotransmitter known as acetylcholine. That's going to make it a cholinergic neuron. And when the acetylcholine binds to the next neuron, it is going to bind to what's called a nicotinic receptor. So this is called a nicotinic receptor, which means it is going to, once it is bound by acetylcholine, it is going to be, some ions are going to travel in and out of the cell to make it depolarize. So we got nicotinic. It is also known as cholinergic because it will pick up acetylcholine. And then for this side, actually let me use a different color. For this side, this neuron will produce norepinephrine, and that is going to be known as an adrenergic neuron. So an adrenergic neuron is going to be any neuron that produces norepinephrine, epinephrine, or dopamine. So all those neurotransmitters are called catecholamines, and it will produce any one of those. In this case, it will produce norepinephrine. And for the target receptor, so this box represents our target. It is going to be alpha 1 and 2 and beta 1 through 3. And this is going to be known as a muscarinic receptor because it is picking up norepinephrine. And because the receptors are going to be alpha and beta. And a muscarinic receptor is a G protein receptor that's going to go through a whole cascade of things before it does its activation. The organs that are affected by this are the heart, the smooth muscles, so like the stomach and the intestines, and the glands. In the second pathway, we're going to have the same thing, acetylcholine, and we're going to have our nicotinic receptor, and this is going to be cholinergic and cholinergic. Here's the thing we want to be careful with though, because our target at the end is going to have an M1 receptor. So it's still going to have a muscarinic receptor, even though acetylcholine is going to bind to this. And it's going to affect generalized sweat or secretory glands. So I'm going to abbreviate that as GSG. And then our third pathway, we have acetylcholine. So this is going to be nicotinic again. And our target is going to be called the adrenal medulla, which is going to produce norepinephrine and epinephrine. Finally, in our parasympathetic nervous system, we'll have acetylcholine again for both the post and preganglionic neuron. The receptors are going to be muscarinic, so that's abbreviated as M. We got 5 of them, so muscarinic receptors. And The organs that will be affected are the heart, smooth muscle, and glands. To go further and finalize our discussion, I'm going to talk about how each different receptor will affect different organs. So first we have our eye, that is going to be affected by alpha-1, which is responsible for pupil dilation. Pupil dilation. And our parasympathetic side is going to be M1 and M3, which is responsible for constriction of the pupil. The second organ is blood vessels, which is going to be alpha-1, which is responsible for vasoconstriction. Then we have the heart, which is going to have beta-1, which will increase the heart rate, and M2 and M4, which will decrease the heart rate. Then we will have our sweat glands, which will be affected by alpha-1 to increase sweating. And then we have the lungs, which will be beta-2, and that's responsible for bronchodilation. And that is it for my discussion on SA3.